Hey guys, so today I have a cool guest with me, Ming from the Oriental Pearl YouTube channel. So you've probably seen her channel's getting really big really quickly. She's really amazing at Chinese and getting pretty good at Japanese as well. And she has lots of cool videos where she goes around Tokyo and interacts with both Japanese speakers and Chinese speakers. And we just recorded a video for her channel where we talk about some of the things that we see in the larger language learning community, particularly the kind of polyglot community that we kind of wanted to call out a little bit of the bullshit, but that was something that we both agreed on. Today on this video, we're going to be talking about things that we don't agree on. When we chatted really quickly the other day, we had I think it was 2 main points, was it, that we disagree on?
Yes, and I added another one. Yeah, we had such a friendly conversation with each other the other day, and we agreed on probably 90% of stuff that I'm like, this is not going to make an interesting video. Let's talk about the points where we disagree. There were a couple of things that I think we could have some conversation about. You know, at the end of the day, there's more than one way to make an omelet. So you can get to the same level and have the same results with your language learning using different methods. And that's really just what we're going to talk about today, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, I think my methods are better, but I mean, yeah, we're all entitled to our own opinion.
Right, of course. Okay, well, we're going to talk about this, Matt.
Okay, so what's the first thing that we don't agree on?
The first thing that we don't agree on is taking formal classes. Now, I'm a big proponent of taking formal classes for a couple of reasons, and I have to say that it made the big difference between it made the biggest difference for me learning Chinese and Japanese is that foundation. I got in a Chinese language school and then later a Japanese language school from the very beginning, and that set the foundation. I was corrected many times. The teacher really set me straight, and there was this atmosphere of competition in the classroom that pushed me to study harder versus if I'm only self-studying, which I did self-study, of course, but that I took formal classes as well. If you're only self-studying, I think a lot of people will fail to motivate themselves to keep going, or they'll go at their own pace, and they tend to go slower than if they were in a classroom with some competition. You don't want to look dumb in front of your classmates, right? I did that a couple times, and I was irritated, and I went back. I'm like, I'm never going to let that happen again. I'm going to learn from these mistakes. I'm not going to say that wrong again. And I'm not going to mess that presentation up tomorrow because I'm going to look like an idiot and they're going to look really good and I'm going to look stupid. So it always motivated me to try harder. So that plus the just the aspect of having a teacher constantly correcting you. I know you talked a lot about forming bad habits. Well, a lot of that stuff, I believe, comes from not being corrected, of course. So how do you get corrected? Well, you have to have someone correcting your writing, correcting your speaking, setting you straight. And I think it's okay for you to try to put the pieces together. Well, how should this sentence be made? I'm just going to take a shot in the dark and see if it works. And if it doesn't, the teacher will correct you. And I learned that way. I have no long-lasting bad habits in Chinese, even from taking these lessons and starting with speaking from the very beginning. I really don't have any bad habits that I couldn't get rid of in the classroom.
Well, I would argue that you were able to reach a really high level of Chinese without any bad habits in spite of speaking early on, not because of speaking early on. But to kind of take a step back, because I think that the speaking early thing is a topic that we're going to get to next, but to focus on the classroom setting. So it sounds like you basically say there's 2 benefits of taking classes. One of them is that it provides you with motivation and an external kind of structure to keep you consistent. And the other one is you get corrections from the teacher. So because I believe that you shouldn't speak from the beginning, precisely because you'll make a lot of bad habits, but we'll get to that. The fact that if you're self-studying, you don't have as much access to corrections isn't really relevant, because I don't think you should be speaking in the beginning anyway. So then it just comes down to the motivational aspect. And I can totally see how taking a class would help you stay consistent and help you stay motivated, but I don't think it's the only way to do that. And I think that it's kind of a suboptimal way to provide that sort of motivation and structure, because first of all, you're in this classroom with a bunch of other people who still suck at the language, and you have to hear their awful pronunciation and all their mistakes, which is feeding bad input into your brain. And also, the pace that you're going to be going at is going to be determined by someone else kind of almost arbitrarily, right? It's like it's the teacher's going to make sure that the class moves at the average pace that people tend to go at. But I think that if you're really motivated, you're generally going to be able to move more quickly than the average that classes tend to move at. And my experience taking Japanese classes in both college and high school was that the pace was really slow, and I was able to go way faster because I had a lot of motivation.
This is the difference, Matt. You went to college classes, which I think are pretty bad for learning languages.
Okay, so we're in agreement about that.
I'm talking about language school, especially the Chinese language school. You're saying you're with a bunch of people. We had 5 people in our classroom. We got so much like one-on-one time with the teacher and so many pronunciation drills, things like that. The pace was incredibly fast. The pace was faster than someone who is self-studying would do versus a university course. Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think that's a good way to study a language at all. And I would even say that some of the language schools here in Tokyo are not very good. They were not nearly as good as that 5-person class that I had 20 hours a week, 4 hours a day, Monday through Friday in China. That was like an intensive course. And you have to realize this is how it's being taught in organizations like the CIA. They have people in these intensive language programs. Boom, 3 years, you are fluent. You're like ready to do some spy work. This is the orthodox method, and I think it's orthodox for a reason, because if it's done intense, full immersion in the classroom, along with self-study, along with some other methods and private study as well with a tutor, I think it's the winning combination there. And I can't say that I only did those lessons at that time. I was also studying at my house. I was also in the environment. I lived with Chinese people as well, so I'd practice what I learned at the school at home. And on top of that, I had a tutor after school, one-on-one, 2 hours a day. It was just like a huge amount of Chinese every single day, and I was making mistakes and being corrected, and it just seemed to be a little bit of everything. But the classes were important for the foundation.
Okay, so now that definitely clarifies things for me a little bit. So if you're saying that when you go to these language schools, they are very intensive, they are going to push you likely harder than you would push yourself if you were self-studying, then I could definitely see how that does add a lot of value. But the reason why I still would never recommend someone to go to a language school is because the methodology and the way that they structure the classes and teach is completely against the way that I think people ideally would acquire a language. And so although it's nice that you have that support and that motivation, that structure, the things they're asking you to do are not the most productive things. And that kind of gets into, maybe that would be a good segue into the next point, which is that I don't think you should speak early. And so to give my take on this one, I agree with the linguist Stephen Krashen when he talks about how there's 2 different approaches to gaining linguistic ability. One is what we might call the skill building approach, which is where you consciously learn about what vocabulary exists in the language, what words mean, and you learn about the grammar almost like as if it was a bunch of math formulas. You memorize the structures of sentences, and then you use this conscious knowledge that you learn to think in your native language and then translate your thoughts into the target language. So that's what Stephen Krashen calls learning. And then on the other hand, there's this process called language acquisition, which is how we learned our first language, which is when you get exposure to comprehensible input in the language and you kind of through an unconscious process, start to build an intuition for how the language works. And once you've acquired a sufficient base of the language, you start being able to kind of speak naturally. And this was my experience in Japanese. And so I think that ultimately the only way to reach really high levels of fluency is through acquisition, because that skill building approach is just too limited. If you're always thinking in your native language and trying to translate in your head, first of all, that's really slow. Second of all, it's going to lead to an unnatural result because language is very highly specific in unpredictable ways. So oftentimes you just have to know a natural way to express a given idea. You can't just kind of deduce how to say it by thinking in English and then translating it with grammar rules that you memorized. It won't lead to a natural result. And so I think that if there was a language school that was built around acquisition, and actually there are schools like this in Thailand for teaching foreigners Thai, I think it's called automatic language growth. There are these programs where they have native speakers who speak to learners of Thai for many hours every day, and they use props and they write on the board and they make it very interactive so that you can understand what they're saying, and they kind of speak simply at first. But they don't force the students to speak at the beginning. The students actually just speak their native language back. And then over time, as they start to understand more and build an intuition for the language, they start being able to speak more naturally. And this is, I think, the ideal. So if you're talking about a language school like that, then I would be all for it. And I think that's pretty ideal. But with the language schools that they have like in Tokyo, where they're just forcing you to memorize all this stuff consciously and they're trying to get you to translate in your head, I have met very few people who had a lot of success with this method.
Fair enough, because the language schools in Tokyo were not that good. They were mostly for people trying to get into senmongakko. But I did make a lot of progress at the Chinese school, and I think they did a very good job with that. Now, about this point, a silent period where you don't talk at all for the first 6 months, no output, just input, input, input. Well, like I said, there's more than one way to make an omelet, and at the end of the day, if you work hard enough, both you and I are going to achieve our goals and reach a high level of that language, but I argue that I could do it faster than you. Because you missed out on the first 6 months. You were completely silent because you're saying that it's going to confuse you. You should just listen and, copy native speakers as it is. But there's an innumerable number of possibilities of word combinations and sentence combinations. The amount of input you're going to need to reach that, I think it's rather slow. And I don't think it damages you to make mistakes in the very beginning. What damages people is when they make the same mistakes for 5, 10 years of speaking English, for example. A lot of my students, they have these habits that I can't even help them correct at this point. It's so ingrained in their brain. But that is not necessarily from the first 6 months of language learning, but from many years of not learning from their own mistakes. I don't have any bad habits that I picked up, and I don't think it's despite the fact that I learned in the first 6 months. I think that was a really good period where I had a teacher by my side who could correct me all the time. I would try to put the sentences together, and I would be correct sometimes. I wasn't 100% wrong every time I tried to make my own sentence. I did get it right sometimes. And the times I got it wrong, she corrected me. I memorized those mistakes, and I grew from it. So I would say that I am proof that you can start from day one, and I encourage people to start from day one. It is unorthodox, actually, to not start speaking from day one. I've never heard that before for my TEFL course. I've never heard that from any linguist. It's Matt's theory, which is fine. But I'm going to say
No. It's Stephen Krashen's theory.
Stephen Krashen's theory.
He's a famous linguist.
Okay. How long did it take you to learn Japanese also, Matt? Because I think that you could have thrown Chinese in there if you had started a little earlier with speaking. That maybe it would slow someone down a little bit if they didn't start in the first 6 months.
Well, I think I reached, I've been studying Japanese for 10 years total, but I basically reached the level that I reach now in a 5-year period.
Oh my gosh.
And personally...
5 years.
And I've never met someone else who was able to... There's a lot of people who are better at Japanese than me, but they have been studying Japanese for like 20 plus years. I've never met someone who reached the level I reached in just 5 years. So I think I actually learned really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Given that you're in the US, you're in an English-speaking environment, that is pretty quick. That is pretty quick.
Because I think the key is I focus on cultivating an intuition for how Japanese is supposed to sound, what is natural. And because I had this intuition, when I started speaking, I got good really quickly. Like I basically, the first couple times I spoke, I was already mostly fluent. And within a couple weeks, I was already totally fluent because I had it in my head. I just had to learn how to get it out, you know?
There's a little thing with muscle memory as well with the speaking aspects. There's some similarities between playing an instrument and speaking a language where your mouth has to move in a certain way and you might hear it, but it takes a little bit of training to repeat those sounds, especially with Chinese and the tones and the weird positions you have to put your tongue in to make some of these sounds. And I would argue that if you're only getting input in the first 6 months, that you're not going to develop that muscle memory. And in that case, it's going to slow your pronunciation acquisition down quite a lot for 6 months.
Well, so I think there's two things you got to separate. One of them is your perception of the sounds, and the other one is your ability to produce the sounds. So for example, at the level you're at now with Chinese, when you listen to most most second language speakers of Chinese speak Chinese, you can hear what is off about the pronunciation, right? It's just like how, when either of us hear a second language speaker of English, whenever they mispronounce something or they get a vowel off or a consonant off, it's like we immediately can hear what is wrong. We don't have to think about it. It's just like clear as day intuition. Just like when you hear someone sing and they miss the note. And so that is what I call perception. It's you have an intuitive and embodied direct sense of what it's supposed to sound like. And so as a beginner, there's no way that you're going to be able to get this through practice. Like you can get closer and closer to the sound by having a native speaker correct you, but in order to be able to hear it, you have to actually listen to actual Chinese for hundreds and thousands of hours. That's the only way to get the ear for exactly what it's supposed to sound like. And so for me in Japanese, when I first started speaking, I knew exactly what Japanese was, not exactly, but I had a pretty good ear for what it was supposed to sound like. And because of that, I could give myself feedback very quick. I could kind of create this feedback loop where I'd say something, I could hear it was off. I'd say it, I'd move my tongue a little bit, I'd say it again, it was a little closer. I'd move my tongue again, it got a little closer. And so within just a couple weeks, I could go from not great pronunciation to pretty great pronunciation because I knew what it was supposed to sound like. That's why I think the perception is the most key thing. And that comes from input and actually listening to what it's supposed to sound like.
I agree about the input things. But at the same time, especially with pronunciation, now I was a business major. So I kind of think of things in economical terms sometimes. You have a diminishing margin of return. That, well, for me, I'm about, at this point, I'm still working on Japanese. Especially here in Tokyo, I have time to do that. But Chinese, I think I've reached about as close to native as I'm going to get, considering that I started at after 20 years old. I think you started Japanese when you were still a teenager, right? You were a high school student?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
yeah,
good.
Like 16.
Then you have a little bit more of a chance rather than someone who started, say, Japanese at 25 years old.
And I will say, I don't think I sound like a native speaker. I definitely don't. I'm not perfect. And I also agree that there's diminishing returns after a certain point, and it doesn't make sense to obsess over perfection too much, especially with pronunciation.
You should get as good as you can, but at the end of the day, I told my students, I've seen people speak perfect English and work at a bookstore, and people like Japanese businessmen who spoke English with a little bit of an accent that were, executives in companies. They just put that energy towards other aspects of their lives, like IT or business management skills or something else. So you got diminishing a margin on returns. You spend 100 hours like perfecting your Japanese these little sounds, these little inconsistencies a little more, or you could spend 100 hours learning IT and make more money at your job or something like that. So, I mean, there's a balance to be found there. And at the end of the day, when you start like Japanese, as I did at 25 years old, there's limitations there. I really can't become a native speaker. It's never going to happen. But that didn't stop me from going to Waseda. That didn't hold me back during the international relations courses that I took there, talking with Japanese people doing presentations. I got my meaning across, and I still strive to improve. But I didn't study a lot with the pitch accent. You did a lot of lessons about that. I do think there's value in that. But at the end of the day, you got to balance that with other things as well.
Definitely.
We only have so much time, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you with that. But I think that's a little bit different conversation than if you only have 100 hours, how are those 100 hours best spent? And I think it's a different conversation than should we put in 100 or 500 hours? And ultimately, when I'm talking about language learning, 100 hours isn't even that much. But I mean, just on principle, right? So I would kind of argue that, like, for example, if you're a Japanese person who just started learning English, in my experience, most of the time, Japanese people can't hear the difference between the English L and the English R. So if I say right versus light, they think I said the exact same thing. At least that's what it sounds like to their ear. So if they were to try to, right off the bat, spend a lot of time learning how to pronounce the difference between L or R, they'd be spending a lot of time like reading diagrams of how to put their tongue and then having a native speaker tell them that they're wrong over and over and over, and they're just trying, right. And I've seen Japanese people try to do this. Or they could put all that time and energy into listening to English and then actually start to develop the capacity to hear the difference in those sounds. And then when they start speaking, they'll be able to give themselves the feedback, whether it's right or not, right or wrong, and they'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly. So I would say, given a limited amount of time, it's actually better to focus all your time and energy on input up front, because that's going to allow you to improve your output really quickly down the line.
Matt's trying to put our Eikaiwa no Gakko out of business. We're going to lose all of our beginner students. Well, although I think that's a little unorthodox, but I mean, at the end of the day, there's more than one way to make an omelet, but I do think that it could be sped up by learning in the first 6 months. But I do have one more point that we didn't discuss before, because I found it in your videos.
Let's hear it.
All right. I think we have a different definition of what fluency is, because I saw one of your videos where I think I just saw the title where you had said that someone is JLPT N1 level, still not fluent. So what is fluency for you? Because in my understanding of fluency, you would be far past the level of fluency if you can pass JLPT N1, unless you're one of those Chinese students that just passed it because you know a lot of kanji. But if you're a native English speaker, if you could reach N1, you in my definition, you far past fluency. You're way beyond that.
Well, so first of all, the way that I feel towards the word fluency or fluent is that it's kind of overloaded at this point. Everyone has their own definition, and so in a way it's not very useful anymore as a word. Yet at the same time, you just can't get away from it because it's the number one word everyone associates with success in language learning, right? And proficiency in language learning. So I always have this ambivalent relationship with it where it's like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, in a way with this word fluent. But what I would say with the JLPT is that the JLPT is not a very good predictor of someone's language ability, because I've met people who actually can't pass the JLPT, but are completely what I would call fluent. They're completely conversational. They can use the language to do everything they need to do in their day-to-day life. Yet, on the other hand, there's people who just spent a lot of time doing book study. They didn't actually listen to any real Japanese. They didn't do a lot of actual conversational practice. And so they passed N1 because they just crammed all this knowledge, but they are not very functional in the language at all. And that person I interviewed, I would say he was an example of that, where he spent a lot of time studying about Japanese with textbooks and things like that, but he didn't spend a lot of time actually engaging with the reality of the language. And so he had a lot of knowledge, but not a lot of embodied ability.
Yeah, that happens. And you're absolutely right. I think that JLPT is even less accurate than HSK, the Chinese test, because it doesn't even have a writing component, whereas HSK does. You have to write an essay. Maybe my standards for fluent are a little bit lower. I think that most students that are even lower intermediate are quite fluent. Basically, in my understanding of what fluency is, either from my TEFL courses or whoever taught me at some point in my life, is that you can just speak without stopping a lot. I have so many students that will stop and go, ですね、なんだろう。Or just long ums and ers, or they can't form a nice fluid conversation. It's not smooth. So the standards for fluency, I think maybe mine are more basic than some other linguists.
Well, how do you take into account this component of language ability where someone might be able to speak fluently on one topic, but not on another topic? Like maybe when they're at the bar with their friends, they can talk about the topics that they tend to talk about very fluently, like what's up with their girlfriend and their dog and what happened at work that day. But then on other topics, like things on the news or just things that they're not used to talking about, maybe they can't talk about it at all.
I would still consider those people to be fluent, but not intermediate or advanced. Those are more advanced topics, so they haven't gotten to the advanced level yet. They can't form a good fluid conversation talking about politics or talking about religion or talking about academics. Well, that's a whole nother level. That's advanced Chinese or advanced Japanese or business level. But that doesn't mean they're not fluent. They can generally convey what they want to convey, albeit it might be a bit messy. It might be a bit messy and it won't be what they want to say. But fluency, from my perspective, is a pretty low level.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I don't have a really strong feeling about it besides I think that ideally we need some new vocabulary to talk about language ability. Ideally one that's a little bit more specific because, again, like how fluidly you're able to talk, how well you're able to talk without hesitation is a totally different thing than how nicely formed are the sentences that come out of your mouth, and how pleasant is your pronunciation to listen to, right? And that's another thing of how broad is your competency in the language. Can you read and write? Can you only speak? Can you only talk about a limited range of topics? So there's so many components to language ability that I think that having just one label, fluency, that everyone has a different meaning of and is such a nebulous word, is partially part of the reason why I think a lot of people have a lot of naive views on language learning and don't realize that there's a lot more depth to it than some of these internet polyglots make it out to be. And that's what we just talked about on on the other video on your channel.
Matt, we need to stop agreeing with each other so much. This is supposed to be a debate. But at the end of the day, I don't want to get chewed out by your fans because they probably don't know me and they think I'm attacking your theories, which I'm not. I just, I'd like to have a conversation because there's different methods. No one method is the golden method. But I think there's some faster ways to do certain things, and it's open for discussion. It's open for debate, just like the fluency debate.
Yeah, and like more than anything, I think it's really important to have conversations with people with different opinions, be able to recognize everyone's humanity, even if you have some little differences in opinion. And it's totally okay to agree to disagree.
Well, we agree to disagree on some points. Well, Matt, if you come to Japan, we should hang out. We'll hang out with your buddy Tikyo Sam. He's a friend of mine. Yeah, we got the connection up in here. So I hope that I could see you one day over here in Japan. It was really cool to do this video with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And everyone go and check out Ming's channel. A lot of really cool interactions with Japanese and Chinese people, and a good view into what it's like to live in Tokyo.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. And I hope we can work together again.
ぜひぜひ。
All right. じゃあね。バイバイ。